Welcome back to our mini podcast series, The Hidden Risk Human Capital in the Investor's Blind Spot. We have looked at toxic leadership, charismatic founders, invisible workers, child labor, and broken supply chains, and the risk investors face when human rights slips through the cracks. But what if the problem isn't lack of action, but the wrong kind of action? Today, we are digging into how do you build human rights due diligence that actually works in different kinds of companies, different geographies, and different industries. And what investors should be asking based on the business model, size, and supply chain footprint of a company. Let's start with a quick scenario. You are looking at two companies. One makes construction materials inside your country, all operations in one state. The other is a cosmetic brand that sources mica from India, packaging from China, and ships globally. Both of them claim they have done HRDD. But can they use the same tools, same assessments, and same audit checklists? Not if you want the truth. HRDD frameworks also matter, and they are not one size fits all. Joining me today is Moni Shankar, Lodha & Co LLP, a business and human rights expert who advises companies and investors on responsible sourcing, labor rights, and supply chain governance. Let's start with understanding the landscape. So, my first question to you, Moni, is what are some of the main HRDD frameworks companies and investors use today?
First of all, many thanks for this wonderful introduction. This is a very, very important point to begin with as far as HRDD is concerned, as we have spoken in the previous two episodes as well, where we have been elaborating on HRDD and labor rights in this particular series that we are talking about. HRDD is not only one framework. HRDD is a mindset. Let me spell out what is an HRD first. It is human rights due diligence. So let's double click on human and let's triple click on rights over here. The difference vis-a-vis a human rights based approach to a risk based approach, which usually takes place in the ESG discourse and dispensation, is that we center the voice of the human, whether it is the worker, mainly the worker, the vulnerable worker at the shop floor. We take that voice and bring it to the boardroom. We bring it to the public market. We bring in to the investor community. That is the central point of a difference between an ESDD and HRDD. So let me explain. An environmental and social due diligence comprises on a multitude of indicators. In environment, it is carbon, biodiversity, waste management, water footprint, and it talks about a multitude of indicators and frameworks, including local regulations, international regulations, soft regulations, voluntary frameworks. And if we double click on the social, right, the social is also very broad. We talk about labor rights, worker rights, grievance mechanisms. We also talk about community when we talk about social. We talk about supply chain, we talk about employees, we talk about contractors, we talk about a lot of things. However, how does a social due diligence differ from a human rights due diligence? There is a big difference to it. In the human rights due diligence, we take a rights-based approach to due diligence where we focus on the vulnerable voice in the supply chain, which is the worker. So the big difference in an HRDD is to bring the invisible, muted, erased voice of the worker in your supply chain to a C-suite, a boardroom, and a publicly listed company conversation. That is what it is. Now, how do we frame the human rights due diligence in terms of frameworks? There is a multitude of frameworks again. There is no paucity of frameworks in this world. There is a lot of frameworks, intellectual activity, models, theories regarding how human rights should be done. But the main, like a foundational framework is the UNGPBHR, United Nations General Principles on Business and Human Rights, which came out 15 years back, and it focuses on remedy, protect, and redressal. So those are the three main pillars. So how do we break it down? It talks about how to protect the worker. It talks about how to remedy what has been done wrong. So a large emphasis on the UNGPBHR is on redressal. It's on protection. It's on making sure that the worker is heard, that if anything wrong has been done against the worker, we take care of how grievances are noted, and also how things can be made better in terms of a restorative justice kind of a way. And a lot of talk about UNGPBHR has been mentioned about the just transition, right? That we are moving from fossil fuels to clean energy to low carbon dispensation, right? But in the just transition is actually justice. So how do we marry or bridge the notion of justice within a very corporate setup, in a very workplace kind of a setup, with a rights-based approach, which is the foundation of the UNGPBHR. So over here, rather than thinking from a purely framework-centric thinking, which is embedded in the notion of KPIs and indicators and reporting, right? We report, but what is the why behind the reporting? What are we thinking to report? And where does it come from? It's very, very important. So it's the UNGPBHR, which is the motherboard of a framework as far as the BHR dispensation is concerned. Of course, we talk about the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights in 1948, which is an absolute start after the Second World War. We also talk about a bunch of ILO conventions on forced labor, child labor, health and safety, women at work. Recently, in the past few years, decent work has been championed by ILO and the UN as a matter of integrating dignity at work, like occupational health and safety is traditionally not considered a human rights line item, but occupational health and safety is fundamental to building a rights-based approach in many industries, such as mining, such as construction, such as anything which deals with very risky labor, and that's fundamental. One of the examples of human rights due diligence frameworks is actually the modern slavery legislations in the UK, which came out in 2015. There is a modern slavery legislation even in Australia. There are corporate transparency legislations in Norway, in France. There is a supply chain legislation in Germany, LKSG, which is now on pause thanks to the new dispensation in power. And also the HRDD has been a very key component of the EU CSDDD dispensation as well. Although the new omnibus is trying to water it down to the top 1,000 odd companies, and there has been a beautiful report in SOMO, which is pressure group come think tank on the corporate accountability space, saying that the new omnibus will only cover a very trivial amount of companies. But the idea of the HRDD is to, again, let me recap, reiterate that it is about bringing the invisible worker in a supply chain into light, into regulatory and reporting light. And that light is often missing because these workers are often hidden behind layers of paperwork and supply chains, and they are not even seen.
Great, Moni. So, my next question is, are these frameworks only for big multinational companies? Or should small and mid sized businesses or their investors be thinking about HRDD too?
That is a superb question. So I would build upon what I said in the previous question. So the EU CSDD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and the omnibus, which is coming into discussion in the recent days, is about bringing the scope down to only the biggest companies, right? So it's only a handful of a few hundreds company globally who will be impacted, and they have multiple supply chains in nature, and one company might be having about 20 subsidiaries globally, and they will be having multiple supply chains as well. So it's a very complex web, or it's a complex financial geography, right? Which would be covered and under the omnibus, and that also they will have about 4.5 years until 2029 to comply with. So to answer your question, yes, it is right now a big organization issue, because a legislation, a regulation is not enough. It also takes people internally to deliver on the legislation, to report on the legislation. It takes millions of dollars for a big organization to do a reporting, like when big banks or big organizations do TCFD reporting, or they spend millions of dollars behind a consultant to do the reporting at the end of the day. So in order to report on the EU Triple D omnibus, big organizations will be spending hundreds of millions of dollars in order to report, and a large component of that will be HRDD, and it's I would say that it's expensive, but it's valuable. It's valuable to have a transparency, traceability within your supply chain, and I would say that a big organization is also a set of very small organizations. So it's not only a big organization issue, because I've seen many a time that many big behemoths, corporate behemoths, have not only one company, but there are multiple listed companies and multiple unlisted companies as well. So it's a very complex endeavor. So sometimes the very notion of being big by market cap is a very it's not the right way to assess the complexity of a supply chain. You might be a very specialist kind of a brand, but you might be having a very sophisticated supply chain. For example, you might be bringing one thing from Thailand, another thing from South America, another thing from you might be bringing from Africa, for example, something like a mobile battery, right, or an EV battery, which is 70% of a smart car, right, or an EV vehicle, has so many critical minerals in it. And it might be lithium from Chile, it might be copper from Congo, it might be processed in a facility in Jebel Ali in Dubai, and then it might be exported onto a supply chain in China, then exported on to Malaysia for testing and for assembling, and it'll pass through Singapore onto some place onto some place in Europe, for example. So these are extremely complex, dense, intense supply chains, and how do you actually map these? But but the main element of an HRDD is traceability, which is invaluable for a supply chain. For responsible procurement, the heart of responsible procurement is how do you make it responsible? What do you consider it as responsible? How do you take a rights-based approach? For example, rights of an employee versus a contractor are very, very different under law.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Are very, very different under law. Are you a contractor of a tier 1.5 supplier? Are you a direct employee of a tier 1 supplier? So even your definition of rights and what are you entitled to is also defined by where you are exactly in the value chain of a big organization. And whether you are a IC independent contractor, whether you are a temporary worker, whether you're on permanent payroll. So your notion of what rights you can exert are also very different.
Okay. So we understand human rights due diligence has to be proportional. Not every company needs a 40-page policy, but every investor should ask where could harm happen and what is the company doing to prevent it. My next question is, how should HRDD look different for a company that only operates domestically? For example, a logistics or staffing firm based in one company. And if you flip it, what about a company with overseas suppliers or outsourced manufacturing?
Those are excellent comparative case studies to draw from and to think with and to think through it. Okay, if you're a domestic company, why would you need an HRDD? The reason is very simple. You would need traceability. And a lot of companies simply do not have an oversight of where they procure stuff from, who the subcontract workers are. For example, even in the most reputed organization, the security guard has different rights. The person who makes tea in your pantry is not on your payroll. The person who is basically a janitor, for the lack of a better term, is not on your payroll. Right? These are all third-party subcontract workers, and many a time these third-party subcontract workers are more than your permanent employees. So how would you check whether the boy in the pantry is being paid, whether his social security, he or she's social security or is being paid, because of course the salaries are less than 21,000 a month. So are there challans being paid by your subcontractor? Are you making sure that that's being done? And wages are fundamental, right? Are you making sure that the security agency which you have hired, which deploys 2 security guards every day, right, for 2 shifts, are being paid their overtime, because their normal working hours are 8 hours. So are they being paid for the extra 4 hours which they serve? Everybody in the supply chain, right, whether the boy in the pantry or your security guard, is being accorded decent work conditions and a certain sense of dignity. And that's for the domestic organizations. If you have a global supply chain, for example, if you are in RMG ready-made garments, or if you are in something such as an EV battery manufacturing company, right? In India, for example, anywhere, essentially in the Guangzhou region, which is the EV manufacturing capital globally, right? You have traceability, you have accountability for your parts, because most of the components which are coming to China will be coming from countries in South America, like Chile, for example. In Africa, it will come from Sub-Saharan Africa, in Nigeria, Niger, Congo, Burkina Faso, Chad. Exactly not the most rigorous places in the world as far as corporate accountability are concerned, right? So how do you make sure that in such a complicated supply chain, you have oversight? And often the synonym for HRDD is oversight, traceability, and accountability. It's not really about rights in the very active sense of the term, but it has to be seen from a very accountability lens. So what companies normally do in terms of best practices, have somebody sitting in Shenzhen in China from your company making sure that the regulatory paperwork, the environmental and social safeguards in terms of legal compliances are taken care from a Chinese standpoint, but also have people regularly visit your suppliers in Africa, in Latin America as well. So traceability does not come from sitting in an office in some commercial district globally, right? It comes from being actually on site, making sure that you actually have boots on the ground, trying to check. And many a time you wouldn't have if you're a small company, right, or an SME, you wouldn't have the bandwidth. And I don't expect you to have the bandwidth. But what you can do is you can hire consultancies, you can hire NGOs, you can make sure that you can talk to somebody in the responsible mining ecosystem, for example, which is there globally. You can talk to somebody in the responsible procurement ecosystem globally, which are plenty of them around, and talk to them about technology solutions regarding RFIDs, about traceability, about where does the mineral come from, where does the land up, and how do you actually take care of their expansive global supply chain geography, which one has to deal with, and many a time your HSC manager or your supply chain manager would not have the technical competence for that. And as I said, that it's all a work in progress. Nobody is asking a SME to know everything from day one. And that is not the purpose of this dialogue through this podcast series. We are not trying to indict anybody over here, but we are trying to encourage through awareness that there are ways and there are means to do better. So that's what it is. A domestic company improves traceability, making sure that wages are paid, licenses are in place, have an oversight of your beyond tier 1 suppliers. If you have an overseas supply chain, things get more complicated, but as I have seen through my research, seen through my advisory work in the past, that there are ecosystems in place for everything. So if you're in RMG space, there's an ecosystem for that. If you are in a palm oil arena, there is MSPO, there's RSPO. There's a completely different traceability ecosystem for that. If you are in rare earth metals, EV batteries, there is a completely different ecosystem for that. Then, and the electronics industry has had a traceability mechanism in place called RBA, or the Responsible Business Alliance mechanism, for many, many years, and it's not new. Intel set up its first overseas facility in Penang in 1972. So it's been already 50 years of semiconductor manufacturing in Asia, which not many people understand.
Yeah. So my takeaway is, if your company works with vulnerable groups, with seasoned labor or complex supply chain, the framework has to go deeper. If it's local and lean, the focus shifts, but the responsibility doesn't. Moving forward, as an investor, how can one assess whether a company's HRDD process is meaningful or just a PDF sitting on a shelf?
Which is another amazing probe to think with. A lot of sustainability is about frameworks, it's about reporting, it's about compliance, it's about a tick box exercise, right? So there can be two approaches to HRDDs, right? You do it for compliance, you do it for supply chain compliance. For example, if you are SME, which is supplying IKEA, Honeywell, you are supplying to a global brand like Tesco. So you do what you have to do as a tier 1 supplier, to do an HRDD, to do a human rights risk assessment, making sure all your SOPs are in place, making sure that you have a supply chain responsible procurement manager in place, which doubles up as a HSC manager, which doubles up as your social compliance manager, which doubles up as something else often. So you have a person who is triple hatting or double hatting most of the time. What you can do is make sure that whatever compliance you have, it is a living document. So the ethic of compliance is that it's a regulatory requirement, and regulatory requirements have to be refreshed. So let me put it some other way. A regulatory requirement is a social contract between your organization and the regulator, and it's timely in nature, and it is time bound in nature. So you have to refresh your social contract with your regulator at periodic intervals. That is ethic of compliance. That is the foundational aspect of compliance, right? So it can sit on your like document management system. It can sit on your SOPs. It can sit on your environmental management system folder, which nobody reads beyond their joining date and beyond the like onboarding programs, right? But it has to be something like POSH, right? In India, it's legally mandated that you have POSH trainings every year, and there is a refresher for that every year. It's legally bound, right? So treat your HRDD something as that. Mm-hmm. Treat your HRDD like a social contract between your supplier, between your downstream supply chain, your employee, your contractors, and doing a HRDD really brings into light a lot of traceability issues which you might not have seen. It might not have to be a public-facing document. It can even be a document for the board, but at least it's being done. Mm. And it's up to a very creative sustainability leader to use that HRDD documents and create a plan of action which can be refreshed at regular intervals. Like, for example, identify who your vulnerable workers are, identify who your women employees are, if they need a crash, for example, or if the complaint mechanisms are in place. Every sector has its own ecosystem, as I said. Every sector will have its own dynamics, and how to refresh the social contract through the HRDD as a live document will depend upon how it is applied at the end of the day.
Great. So the important takeaway for investors, it's time to ask smarter questions. HRDD isn't about checking if the company did something. It's about checking if they did the right thing for their context. So the next question is, what's the investor's role especially in early stage companies or fast scaling startups, in shaping good HRDD from the start?
Like, for example, a lot of investment money is going to AI, for example. So there's a current buzz, right? Everything is Gen AI, ChatGPT, etc., etc. But nothing in AI works without critical minerals, right? Nothing works beyond data centers if you don't have the right data centers in place. And if those data centers don't have a steady energy supply to it, right, through a base load supply, through thermal or nuclear, it doesn't work that way, right? Or for example, natural gas. Of course, natural gas is a transition energy element over there. Um, so very important point is that investors will trigger an ESDD if they will see that the investee company or their investment has supply chains in what we would see as fragile contexts or fragile countries. It will trigger. For example, when Telenor, the Scandinavian telecom company, wanted to invest in Myanmar. Of course, they have exited Myanmar now because of the military coups and everything. When they wanted to invest in Myanmar, they had done an HRDD and ESDD in detail. For example, when petroleum.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
And when petroleum company wanted to invest in exploration asset in Papua, PNG, they had triggered over there. Or for example, when most of your procurement and supply chain lies in Southeast Asia, where a lot of migrant workers are involved in the supply chain, right? From various countries in South Asia or Indonesia, it calls for triggering of an HRDD. So again, if I'm an investor who is investing in AI, in technology, EVs, smart tech, I would definitely trigger an ESDD, HRDD for my investing company because it's rife with risks at the end of the day, and any wrong step would mean a tremendous erasure of shareholder value, and arresting that slide is all about doing a good risk assessment. And from an investor perspective, I think so. Most ESG managers in investment funds or VC funds are acutely aware of downstream risks, and I think so. There can be more emphasis on that in particular sectors.
Great. So, what we have learned is clear. Good human rights due diligence isn't a legal footnote, it's a roadmap. But it's only useful if it matches the terrain. My last question. Some investors worry that HRDD slows growth or adds cost. How would you respond to that?
Which is again a very chicken and egg kind of thing to ask. I would say that doing good business is not a cost. Doing good business makes sure that your risks are covered. Nowadays, companies are being taken to court for human rights violations. Recently, a very big British electronics company was taken to court by their supply chain workers to a high court in the UK, for example. There are tremendous examples of large oil companies being taken to court in the Netherlands. There are so many examples of climate litigations and human rights litigations nowadays happening, that I would say that is a no-brainer. I would rather pay a consultant to do a good HRDD than pay a lawyer to fight it out in court. And sometimes doing the right thing is doing smart business. It covers your risk very, very well.
Correct. So, my closing thoughts, whether it is a small firm with a big contract or a global brand with local impacts, the human risks are always there. The only question is who's paying attention? In our next episode, in our podcast mini series, The Hidden Risk Human Capital in the Investor's Blind Spot, we will dive into the economics of wage suppression and how low wages leads to high turnover, low morale, and long term loss. As a case scenario, we shall investigate the boardroom and ask why human capital rarely makes it into merger and acquisition conversations and what's at stake when talent walks out the door after acquisition. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you, Moni, for your deep insights. Truly helpful.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful conversation, and looking forward to the next podcast episode in this wonderful series. And I hope that it benefits the listeners in our ecosystem.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai. This audio was created with podcastle.ai. This audio was created with podcastle.ai.